I'd like to push off from what Karen was saying a minute ago about facilitation, that one of the things that, one of the conclusions that I came to very early on in the piece, only about a year after Joanna, Macy and I had first designed our first experiential deep ecology process, the Council of All Beings, was that I wrote to her and said, because I was working in Australia, she was working in the United States, I was finding every opportunity to rope in a group of people to participate so that I could practice more and find out more about how to create the context where the experience of deep ecology could take place. And I wrote to Joanna quite perplexed, because she'd been a workshop facilitator for a long time, whereas I'd been an activist and I was just coming into facilitation. And I said, look, this is going to sound really weird, but I keep making up new processes or stealing processes from other cultures to try them out in these workshops, and everything that I do works. Like, nothing fails. What can this possibly mean? And she replied that she was having the same experience and had come to the conclusion that once a circle of people get together with the shared intention to heal that illusion of separation between ourselves and the rest of the natural world, it doesn't really matter what you do after that, that it's actually the intention that does the work, and that any exercise, any process that's congruent with that intention will serve as a vehicle for that. And then later I came to see that the earth never pushed us away, the earth never rejected us, that if there's a distance, if there's a separation, it all came from our side, and that the moment that we make a gesture of reconciliation towards the earth, it comes flooding back in. You know, that nothing else is holding the earth at a distance from us except our lack of intention. So that, but what that means is that it's an incredibly easy thing to facilitate. You don't have to be very good at it. When I first started, I was terrified. I would much rather be chained to a bulldozer than having to somehow be confident in front of a group of people that I knew what I was doing, you know. But it turned out that it made no difference. You don't have to be confident. None of that really matters. And so this morning I was answering an email from someone who had somehow found my email address, and she's from a Native American Indian reservation in Hot Springs, Montana, and they're having all kinds of environmental problems, and she thought deep ecology would be a really good way to solve it, especially she'd like to have someone do it with the children. Did I know anyone who could do that, you know? And I said, I don't know anyone near Hot Springs, Montana, but you could do it. And I just sent her the links to where we've put links with exactly this purpose of just basic. And I said to her, many people have facilitated this work, having never even experienced a single deep ecology, having never participated in a deep ecology workshop, merely from reading about it. And indeed, there was one woman that wrote to me once from Alaska who had never even read about deep ecology processes. She just read the words, the Council of All Beings, in some, passing reference in some article, and a couple of years later she wrote to me, having then found my contact and read some things, and she said it was amazing. All I had was the title, and I made up the rest, and it worked really well, as it would. So deep ecology is a philosophy of nature. The term deep ecology was coined by Arne Naess, the late Arne Naess, who died a couple of years ago. He was Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Oslo University in Norway, a very famous philosopher, the youngest person to hold a chair in any faculty, I believe, in Norway. He was in his late 20s when he became a professor, and also a very influential environmentalist. Long before people in Australia were doing things like this, he had chained himself to the walls of a fjord in Norway to stop the damming of the fjord. Just one man chained to the fjord, but being this particular man with his reputation, that was enough to stop that particular development from taking place. So that's where he was coming from. And Arne Naess says that underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis is a crisis of consciousness or of spirituality, and that is the illusion of separation between ourselves and the natural world. The fact that this sense of separation that all people suffer from to some extent or other, or from time to time, the fact that this is an illusion can be demonstrated very simply by just holding your breath for 5 minutes while you think about it. And in other words, although deep ecology can be a very mystical, spiritual experience, at root it's just biological. There is the unavoidable fact that we are inextricably embedded in the nature of this world. We grew from this world. We have no independent existence. What happens to this world happens to us. So there's nothing too challenging about that as an intellectual proposition, but the trouble is that after at least 4 millennia of anthropocentrism, of human-centeredness, this understanding, this intellectual understanding, there's no corresponding experience in the world that we grow up in. There's an interesting story of one of the ancestors of the deep ecology movement, Gary Schneider. I didn't tell this story last night, did I? No, good. So Gary Schneider was a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. He was one of the beatnik poets of the late 50s, and in the 60s he got interested in Buddhism and went to Japan, and he's now a Zen Roshi. He runs the what's it called? The String of Bones Zendo in Grass Valley, California. But in any case, during the 70s, when Jerry Brown was governor of California, 70s was a very radical time in California, and Jerry Brown was a very radical governor, and Gary Schneider, the poet and deep ecology ancestor, was part of Jerry Brown's administration, but he was a burr in the sock of that administration, you might say, and eventually the governor, Jerry Brown, says to Gary Schneider, the poet, "Gary, why is it that whatever the issue, you're always going against the flow?" And Gary replied, "Jerry, what you call the flow is just a 16,000-year eddy. I'm going with the actual flow." So it gives a sense of what Arne Naess would later explain as saying that ecological ideas are not enough. What we need is ecological identity, ecological self. So the Deep Ecology project is a project about the transformation of self, the transformation of our identity, of who we experience ourselves to be. And that metaphor of the flow and the eddy suggests that 16,000-year eddy is the whole civilization kind of project that for since the advent of agriculture, when we first began to shape the earth, more and more human beings have had the opportunity to imagine ourselves as being somehow defined by the society that we live in, by the society of humans that we live in, and the opportunity to forget that society is underpinned, that there is a biological foundation to that, and unless that society somehow resonates correctly with the biological foundation, it's not going to be supported. So, there's this vast river of life that's been flowing for 4,000 million years on the Earth, and then 16,000 years ago, just a tiny blip on that huge time scale, there's this little eddy where the river curls back on itself, and for us who live inside this eddy, surrounded by this eddy, it's easy to imagine that the direction that this eddy is going is actually the direction of life. But the thing about an eddy is that it actually moves, it can move in a direction that's contrary to the direction of the river. And that appears to me to be what's taking place.